Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Real Reflective Practice for doctors with me, your host, Dr. Anjali Pereira, the Disillusioned Medic. Thank you so much for coming tonight and for joining me. A couple of quick announcements before we start. I've been asked by a few people how to comment on the chat on the side. So all you need to do is log into your YouTube account. You might already have one if you have a Google account. You can use your login details for that to log into YouTube. But if not, you can sign up. It gives you the option of making your display name whatever you want. So you can call yourself what you want. You don't have to use your real name. If you want to keep things private, so that's fine. And once you've done that, you'll be able to join in the chat. You'll be able to like videos, subscribe to my channel, and comment. Please do continue your comments. I absolutely love reading them. And also, if you subscribe to the channel, that means that whenever I put up a new video, it'll show up in your feed and you'll never miss any content. So it's worth doing if you're enjoying this series. Also, a big bit of news. As of next week, I will be broadcasting Real Reflective Practice to two platforms instead of one. So at the moment, I'm currently just broadcasting to YouTube, but as of next Monday, I'll be broadcasting to Facebook as well. So that's exciting, and hopefully I'll bring a few more people in. So yeah, I'm really excited about that. So let's crack on with today's theme, which is conflict. And I'll start, as always, by telling you a story. When I was an F1, one of my rotations was in acute medicine, and I found myself in conflict with one of my consultants on the medical assessment unit. Now, this consultant had a bit of a reputation for being a hard ass. She didn't get on with many of the other consultants. A lot of the juniors found her style quite demeaning, and she was also a bit erratic. You know, some days she'd be, other days, yeah, she'd be screaming at you. So she was like that with everybody, so we mostly just got on with it. And I didn't really take it personally. But one day, I was on the post-take ward round with her, and she asked me to call up the hematology consultant on call to ask a specific question about a patient with leukemia. And she wanted to check our treatment plan, and I confess I didn't understand much about that particular leukemia-related issue because it was a little complex. So I wrote down word for word what she said to me on my list. And so when I got a moment, I called up the hematology consultant and I repeated what was on my list, and I wrote down the reply. Now, when I brought this back to my consultant, she looked at me with disgust, I think is the only word that I could say. And she said to me, "This isn't what I asked you to ask the consultant." And that left me really confused and shocked because I'd written it down. You know, this was the very thing I was trying to avoid. And then she called up the consultant herself in the middle of the ward in front of everyone right there and then. And she said, "I'm so sorry about my F1. She clearly wasn't listening properly. And she didn't understand what I wanted." And then she went on to have a conversation about this patient herself. And when she put the phone down, she looked at me and she said, "Are you sure you're cut out for this?" As in medicine, as in being a doctor. And I was so upset. I was ashamed. I felt humiliated. I was furious. I felt picked on by this consultant who should either have taken the time to explain to me properly what she wanted, or, given that it was a complex issue, call the consultant herself. And after that, I really hated her. Whenever we worked together in subsequent months, I felt this sense of being at loggerheads with her, even when we were getting along okay. But the funny thing was, as unreasonable as she was in that moment, and as much as I don't agree with her style of teaching, she was right. I wasn't cut out for medicine. And not because of what she was suggesting. It wasn't because I was, incompetent. It wasn't because I was not trying hard enough. It was just because medicine wasn't right for me. And I didn't belong there. And I think perhaps the reason her behavior got to me so much that day, the reason I couldn't just brush it off as her being her usual unpleasant self and not take it personally, was the fact that she had unwittingly hit on one of my deepest, darkest fears of that time. And I just wasn't ready to face it yet. It struck me then that conflict is rarely one-dimensional. It's not merely about cause and effect, right? It's not simply one person's aggression provoking aggression from another. There are a whole host of external and internal factors that complicate the issue. And those complications can be the difference between being able to protect yourself from someone's bad behavior and taking it as a personal attack that can really knock your confidence and leave you feeling vulnerable. So I think this theme of conflict is going to be a really interesting one. And I am delighted to welcome back a guest that I've had on before to talk about it with me. Dr. Amrita Sen Mukherjee is a GP with a special interest in occupational health, Dr. Wellbeing and Positive Psychology. She's been doing so much pro bono work recently since the pandemic started around Dr. Wellbeing. She's just been everywhere, and she's incredibly selfless, and I just admire her so much. She is also the person I did my very first live stream with, so absolutely delighted that she's come back again to talk to me. Ami, welcome. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Hi, Anjali. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that absolutely amazing introduction. I'm really, really honoured that you've welcomed me in such a lovely way. Thank you. I'm really touched.
Oh, you deserve it.
Thank you.
So, Ami, this theme of conflict, let's dive in. It just feels so topical right now, right? In the face of COVID-19. I mean, partly because I think we're hearing so much of the language of conflict. We're hearing war language, like politicians talking about words like redeploying and frontline, and there are wartime measures like rationing going on, and it feels like there's a lot of comparison to the First and Second World Wars, particularly as we've just had VE Day as well. So I'm wondering what conflicts you're seeing in the medical profession right now.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective, Anjali, and I think I would like to, even though the subject is about conflict, and even though I probably mentioned the title to you as well, I want to draw away from the negative connotation around conflict and the wartime rhetoric around conflict. And because I don't think it's necessarily helpful in this context. And I think a lot of medics as well have mentioned that they don't find that very helpful, and they don't want connotations around being called heroes or being called to war. And I think that's, that's really important that we make that distinction. And it's essentially the discomfort and the concern, the anxiety, if you want to call it, that people might be feeling at this time, owing to the emotions, owing to the change in situation, the environment, in the internal and external situation that people are feeling themselves in at the moment. And I think the current situation of lockdown has been particularly difficult for people in this particular situation, and it's emphasized and highlighted the different facets that we have to our identities and to our personalities and to our lives. And what I've been seeing in the work that I've done is this conflict, for want of a better word, of the personal self, the professional self, and the relationships that we have, and the interrelationships that all of these perfectly, or not perfect isn't the right word, but well-crafted, really well-nurtured entities have had, and how these are, in some people's lives, slowly coming apart. And I think that's causing quite a lot of distress in people. Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably a really interesting thing for us to talk about tonight.
No, absolutely. I mean, there are kind of the obvious battles, if you will, that the doctors are almost forced to fight at the moment. I mean, it's not a battle you want to fight, but the battle for PPE, for example, the battle for adequate testing, as well as the actual battle against the pandemic, the coronavirus, and then that leading on to all these internal conflicts within us. So it's just interesting to see how conflict multiplies, how one conflict leads to another, how external conflicts lead to internal conflicts within us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I just want to kind of reflect on something that you mentioned earlier, that nothing really occurs in isolation. Mm-hmm. And there are lots of moving parts to any one story. And if we're having difficulties in our own internal environments, in our own internal selves, that's going to be manifested in our external selves, in our external environments. And so one thing that people probably didn't pay too much attention to prior to this whole situation is the manner in which their lives were crafted. Because for most of us, we got on, we enjoyed our lives, we enjoyed our work, we enjoyed our personal lives. And yes, there are things that we didn't like about them, because that's normal, that's human nature, nothing is perfect. But things, generally speaking, we're working and moving in the right direction. But what's kind of happened with lockdown is it's just changed things, and it's made us analyze things and reflect in a way. It's made us look at the different entities that we have in our lives. It's made us look at our professional selves, what's going on in that environment, our personal selves, because essentially these beings have become less discrete and have become more continuous, because one part of our lives is slowly encroaching on the other part of our life, which is slowly becoming one continuum, essentially. And that's where the conflict seems to be, or the discomfort seems to be arising in a lot of people, because they were allowed to go to work and be at work, and then they could compartmentalize. They could come home and be a parent, or be a partner, or be by themselves and compartmentalize. But now that compartmentalization seems to have broken apart, and it's essentially putting us in a situation where we're having to find a new identity for ourselves in a very short space of time, and that is causing some unease in people. Mm-hmm. And when you're uneasy with your own self, with your own identity, it can be quite disconcerting, and that causes conflict within us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. That sense of clashing of different parts of your lives. I mean, that's essentially what conflict is, right? It's a clash between two different sides, and it doesn't necessarily have to be, one side that has a completely different viewpoint from another. It could be just two different parts of our lives that are conflicting with each other. I'm interested to know if any of our viewers tonight are feeling a sense of conflict at the moment, and have you reflected on this at all, or do you recognize some of the things that we've been talking about tonight in your current lives, or even in your life in general as a doctor? I mean, I'm really interested in this idea of internal conflict, because in many ways it doesn't have to be conflict, right? I mean, one thing that really struck me when I first started delving into the alternative careers community was that there was this small minority of ex-doctors who felt very little conflict over leaving the profession. They had other things going on. They weighed up the pros and the cons, decided, it wasn't for them. And then they looked into the practicalities of leaving, and they just left. Whereas for me, the decision to leave medicine was this existential crisis. I had panic attacks. I fell into this deep depression, and felt so at war with myself. So I guess my question is, what makes something a conflict versus just a balancing almost of, different viewpoints in some ways?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Anjali. I suppose it's the change in function, I would say. The balance is there when we're able to work through our issues, when we're able to figure out a pathway for ourselves, when we're not having a discrete loss of function. And I'm very sorry for the difficulties that you faced when you were leaving medicine. That must have been a very difficult time for you. So I'm really sorry about what you experienced. But I'm really glad that you found your way through it. And I suppose that's the difference. Maybe if at that time when people are having this kind of existential crisis, as you mentioned, there's that loss of function, or there's that loss of being able to process what's right for you, what's wrong for you, and not being able to navigate your own path. I suppose that's where the difference comes in between conflict with yourself, being at war with yourself, not knowing what your identity is, and also finding a balance. So if you were in a more balanced state of mind, it might have been more easy for you to navigate your way through that difficult pathway at that time. And I think that's probably the crucial part of it. It's the difference between functioning, if you see what I mean. And there's nothing wrong with that, Anjali, at all. I think it's really important for us as medics to be open about these types of things and say, actually, when we're in these types of situations, we're in a very privileged position. I think I said it last time when I spoke to you, where we have these support mechanisms in place now. You have, doc health support, you have PHP, BMA are amazing with their wellbeing support, RCGP2, PHP I've just mentioned, but there are so many different organisations out there who can help doctors with different types of support. And I don't think a decade ago people were that aware of the different entities that were there, but also them didn't exist either. And so I think we're in a very fortunate position now where we are more attuned, more aware of coaching, more aware of psychodynamic therapy, CBT, CAT, anything really that might support somebody in a difficult situation. So I think if people are finding themselves in that difficult situation, find a trusted person, find somebody who you can talk to, and use them to help you seek the help that you need.
That is really interesting, actually, what you say about reaching out. I mean, certainly when I left, I think there weren't as many resources out there, but they were there. They certainly were there. But what it makes me think about is, I guess, a huge part of it for me was, what will other people think of me? You know, what would everyone say? You know, if they knew that I'd failed at medicine, it made me feel shame, guilt, you know, general worthlessness. So I guess there's a really interesting example there of the fear of an external conflict driving an internal conflict. And it was also the fact for me that the options seem so polarized, right? I mean, I could either be a doctor or I could be a failure. You know, in my head, there was no in-between space at that time. And I guess that's what conflict is. It is when, you know, the two sides can't see eye to eye, and they're very, very disparate. And you know, I had this recently as well. You know, when they first started talking about calling back retired doctors, I felt deeply conflicted. You know, I felt conflicted between going back to my former self and helping out versus, you know, staying in my current self and not helping out. But I think what I realized with time, I mean, even doing this reflective practice work, it's kind of the balance between the two. It's staying within my current self and also helping out. So yeah, there's the coming together of things that at first seemed polarized and conflicted, but then now seem to have come into that sense of balance. So it's interesting to think about how conflict moves from one state to another.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on something you just said, if that's okay, Anjali, because you mentioned there was a difference between being a doctor and being a failure. And I suppose what comes into that then, or that discussion, could be what somebody's definition of success, or what, because there was doctor on one side and failure on the other, and almost nothing in between. But whereas there are so many shades of grey in between, everything isn't black and white. And so I suppose that's the kind of thinking that we need to try to encourage, that there isn't black and white, you know, things aren't all or nothing. We don't have to think in this all or nothing manner. We don't have to think in black and white terms. There are so many different shades of grey and so many different colours in the garden that we can pick and choose from. And then that kind of leads us to a different question of what people's definition of success. Is your definition of success to just be a doctor, or is your definition of success to be something else? And I don't mean in terms of profession, I mean in terms of to be happy, or to be healthy, or to be in service, you know, of some kind. You know, and everybody has their own definitions of success, depending on their own value system, depending on their own priorities in life, depending on their upbringing, their culture. And that's what makes us all unique, and that's what's beautiful about us, and that we're all unique. We have all walked different journeys, and we all are going in different directions, and no one person is the same. There's no one shoe fits all. But it's just wanting to try to reframe language, reframe that narrative, so that we're not being punitive in our language, but we're being encouraging, to try to shift that mindset, so that we're not thinking of problems, we're thinking of challenges. So then nothing seems insurmountable.
Yeah, no, it is interesting you saying that, because I suppose having that sense of something being, you know, only having one option, and therefore you have to fight for it because that's your own option, only option rather. You know, there's that sense of you have to do everything that you can in order to preserve that single option, because that's all you've got, in a sense. And I think that's probably where most conflicts, I mean, even something as small as a tiny personal conflict versus a massive world war, comes from this sense of only being able to see one reality, right?
Absolutely, yes. And it's just trying to weave in to our sense of being, to our sense of selves, that there are more options. And even though it's not our first choice option, the second, third, fourth, fifth choice options are still there. They're still valid. They're still good, but it might mean some compromise. And I think that's one way of shaping us into helping develop a more positive mindset into this really, really difficult time that we're all facing, because let's face it, this is awful, this is rubbish on so many levels, and there's no point denying it, and there's no point saying, oh, you know, everything's going to be great, because there's a lot of stuff that isn't great, and there's a lot of people who've suffered a lot of heartache because of this situation, and it would be wrong of us to deny that. And so I think if we could try to find some small essence of something to make it a little bit less difficult, I think that's a step in the right direction.
And maybe there's an element of time in that, you know, and in some ways I wonder if the sense of conflict is necessary to feel that, and then to go through the process of being conflicted. Perhaps it signals to us that there is something that we need to be wary of or aware of in our lives. You know, the sense of conflict always comes from somewhere, something that is important to us, right? You know, that kind of, you know, something is important to you when you have big feelings around it. And I feel like that deep sense of confliction is a big feeling. And so I wonder if one of the positive things about that sense of conflict is recognizing that it's there, and therefore kind of having the time to work through that, and kind of letting it almost guide us to that sense of balance at the end.
Yes, I agree. And an analogy to that, I suppose, would be, we have positive emotions and negative emotions for a reason. Negative emotions are actually there to protect us. And so it's the same kind of thing when we're having these feelings of conflict. Actually, why are they there? Are they there to try to protect us? Are they trying to teach us something about our behaviours? Are they trying to work in a way to support us moving forward? What is it that our environment, what is it that our spidey sense is trying to tell us? It must be trying to tell us something. So be aware of that. Be aware of what your environment is trying to tell you. Be aware of what, you know, nature is trying to tell you about your current situation. So I think it's really important for us to have our antenna up around this time and feel what we want to feel. Essentially, don't, you know, allow yourself to feel what you need to feel during this time. And I absolutely grasp onto that concept that you mentioned about, you know, using time, using time as a process of going through this process and going through this notion of letting things absorb, letting things sink in, and just allowing yourself to be. I don't think any of us should be going through this period of time wanting to, and I'm speaking in very general terms, some of us are going to do amazing things in this time. But for me personally, this is a holding space. This is a space for me to just get through. I think that this is a very, very hard period of time for everybody. And if I can get through this time and come out of it, I think I deserve a pat on the back. And I think a lot of people are feeling the same way, because none of us are working in a way that we are feeling that we're at the top of our game. I certainly don't feel like I'm at the top of my game, whether that be because I'm not sleeping enough, or whether that just be because I'm professionally working in my house and I'm being mum as well. And I've also got my husband who's working at the home as well. So there's a lot of kind of juxtaposition in this house, you know, professional and personal entity. And so when you're not working at your full capacity and you're not feeling at your full capacity, just getting through is enough. And I think actually if people are just getting through, that's amazing. And people, you know, shouldn't feel conflicted in the fact that that's all that they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly recognize that in myself, that sense of feeling conflicted, because I feel like I should be doing this, that, and the other, and you know, all of these different parts of my life that kind of still exist, and you want to keep them going, and some of them you have to keep going, but then how do you balance them all? It is like a daily mini conflict all the time with all those tiny little decisions. So So yeah, I'm wondering if you guys listening right now are feeling that sense of conflict at the moment in this lockdown situation. Yeah, let us know in the chat. Annie, I'd like to call back to something that you said about the positives, kind of the driving force of negative emotions almost. It kind of connects to something that it reminds me of something that struck me a couple of weeks ago. It's a bit left field, but bear with me. Okay. The other day, I was watching a documentary about space exploration. Okay. And how we as a human race, got the technology to get into space. And while some of it was just pure scientific endeavor and fascination with the universe, the majority of the big developments that gave us, the technology to get there came out of conflict. They came out of wars. The Second World War and the Cold War in particular pushed, Nazi Germany and then the US and the Soviet Union to build bigger and bigger missiles that could go further and further and travel in shorter time. And the engineering behind that was the reason that we got the kind of rockets that we needed to get out of Earth's orbit. So it just made me think about how we as a human race respond to conflict. And I don't want to say that I'm glad the wars happened, because I'm not, and they were horrific, and they caused so much pain. But I don't know, I'm also deeply grateful for the technology that we have today that makes, our lives as they are today possible. So yeah, I guess it just really made me think about the morality of conflict. And on one hand, it's this deeply destructive thing. And then
I'm so
hello,
sorry.
Are we back?
Yes, I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened. It was my internet.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I think it might have been my internet as well. Apologies,
Right.
everyone. If you're still with us, thank you so much for bearing with. Hopefully now internet issues will be sorted now. So yeah, thank you for sticking with us. Amy, I'm not sure how much of the last point you heard.
I heard you explain about the technology, and then you said that it was the you're grateful for the technology that has been developed during wartime, but you're not condoning war or anything like that. I think that's where I got it cut out. So I apologize.
The quote unquote good outcomes of conflict, and the kind of the really moral and ethical kind of quandaries that come out of that, I suppose.
That's really interesting. And I suppose, sorry, I'm just a bit It's just put me a bit off. I'm so sorry. No, yes, I absolutely agree. And I think we're seeing great things. And I think we're living in this really interesting time where people, and I don't want to go into politics, I want to be quite apolitical in this cast. But I think people are feeling quite conflicted in comparing the global situation and looking at different countries, looking at how people are handling coronavirus in different ways, different places in the world, looking at how we're dealing with it, what our policies are, why are we doing things in particular ways, looking at our PPE. And I think in our country, people are feeling quite conflicted.
Mm-hmm.
But what's happening is it's driving people to do amazing things. The community service, and I'm not saying that's the reason, but what I'm saying is in parallel, people are doing amazing community service. People are doing voluntary work. People are really going out, and just the goodwill that you're seeing in people talking to their neighbours, shopping, looking after the elderly people in their community, looking after young people in their community. It's amazing the things that you're seeing on Facebook, the things that you're seeing yourself physically when you're walking down the road. You stop and you look at people's gardens, you talk to people who you might not have ever spoken to before. You say, oh wow, your house looks really nice, your garden looks wonderful. And it's that kind of community spirit that I think is really coming out of these times of isolation, because we are all being physically isolated. But also another thing is on a more global scale is the rate, and I don't know enough about this because I haven't been up to date in the reading, and I'm gonna not talk about this too much, but the rate at which they're trying to get a vaccine out is phenomenal. I don't know, in my understanding of medicine and of science and research, that they've ever been able to get a vaccine out that quickly. And so in congruency with what you were talking about with the space race, looking at how fast they're trying to get a vaccine out, looking at how they can cut red tape around things, but do things still in a safe manner, in a practical manner, in a way that they're not cutting out the necessary safeguarding around the principles of vaccine production, is phenomenal, because they're wanting to get a vaccine out by the end of the year. And I've never heard of anything like that before, in my understanding. So I think these types of negative situations really do bring out the best in some people.
Yeah, no, it is interesting. I mean, it's amazing to see what people are doing, and there's a lot of talk around kind of using this time as innovative space, reinventing yourself, people doing things like learning languages, or starting businesses now because they have the time. But then I'm so resistant. I always have been so resistant to this idea of meaning making out of suffering. I think the platitude that I hate the most is everything happens for a reason, because I don't like reflecting on something bad and saying that needed to happen because of X, Y, and Z, right? Like that was, I'm glad that happened because, then I had this growth or this development. I'm so attracted to this idea of calling suffering what it is and saying it's just suffering and just grieving it and letting go of any kind of attempt to make it positive. So it's really interesting putting that in conversation with someone like you who, you study positive psychology. And I suppose my only kind of response to that is sometimes that's all you can do. Sometimes all you can do with the most terrible of suffering is to meaning make. And yet I do feel conflicted about it in so many ways.
Yeah, I don't think there's an answer to that, Anjali. And I think that's the beauty of being a human being. We don't have all the answers. We're on this constant journey of learning. And the more we learn, the more we realise that we don't know. And the more we don't know, the more we realise we have to learn. So it's, I think for me, in contrast to what you say, quite a lot of my being and quite a lot of my life is lived by the philosophy of everything happens for a reason.
Really?
Because a lot of the things that happened in my life, I've had to go by those that philosophy, and I haven't seen that as a negative thing. And this is just my viewpoint. I've seen that as a way of working through the suffering, acknowledging the difficulties, but seeing it as a means to work through it and get to a more positive place. So I almost spun it on its head, and that's not me doing it. That was teachings from my mother and my father. That wasn't something I was imbibed with. That was something that I was taught. And I think that's very, very interesting. And we all just have to find our own way. And I don't think there's a right way, and I don't think there's a wrong way. I think that we all have our own ways. And this is, again, I go back to my previous point, comes from our culture, comes from our being, comes from our life, comes from our journey, comes from our identity, purpose, and values. And there is no one size fits all. And actually, I don't really have an answer to that, apart from to say that the good thing is to talk about these things, to share knowledge, to have generative thought, and to just keep discussing these things, because it's only by discussing them that we can understand how to get through things, and how to understand what conflict really is, and how we can work through our own internal conflict as well.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I don't think there is an answer. I think it's as you say, it's very, very personal. For me personally, coming from my point of view, I had an accident when I was a baby, and got very severely burned, and ended up going through a lot of reconstructive surgery and having a really difficult time with it. And so I think that's where my resistance comes from. You know, that sense of almost meaning making from suffering and from conflict. It's calling back to that earlier idea of condoning what happened, and then I suppose my fear is then of minimizing and invalidating that experience. But I suppose what you're saying is that it's processing that experience and allowing your grief process to happen. It's allowing yourself to feel the way that you feel, but then when you get to the stage where you can move on from it, that's the point where you bring in that kind of more positive spin, that positive narrative to it. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and you have to be in the right frame of mind to do that. And it's not just, it's very invalidating to be in a place where you're feeling certain emotions, and for someone to just say, oh, come on, it's all right, everything's going to be all right, because that's it's not accepting of somebody's state of mind. It's not accepting of somebody's journey. And we need to go through our journeys, whether we go through them with somebody, or if in preference we go through them on our own. Everybody has their own personal preference, and I think that's really key here as well, that everybody has their own personal preference, and what's right for one might not be right for someone else. But using that positive mindset, using that shift, that change in narrative, you can only do that when you're in the right place. And if you're not in the right place to do that, and you don't feel that you will get to that right place, again, I go back to my earlier point of seek help, because seeking help is that there's no shame in that, there's no stigma in that, and we really need to rid our profession of that, because we see a lot of trauma, we see a lot of emotional trauma, we hold a lot for people around us, and we do that in a very safe psychological space for others. So we should have that space reciprocated to us as well. And that goes for all healthcare professionals, pharmacists, nurses, HCAs, doctors, receptionists as well, because they see a lot as well. Admin staff, everybody sees a lot, they hold a lot. And so we all should have that opportunity to debrief and to have our own psychological needs and requirements attended to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Hannah agrees. She says, I completely agree with you both. Conflict and difficult situations can often drive innovation, empathy, and a sense of togetherness that is always needed to help us get through the situation itself. Absolutely. I think we are seeing that right now, and in some ways that's all you can do in times of extreme conflict is band together. And I think that's probably why there's so much comparison now to the kind of the war spirit, that feeling of being in it together, of camaraderie. It is interesting to hear from doctors even though they're going through such a horrific time in hospitals and other staff as well, but even though it's so difficult on the front line of COVID-19, it's interesting to hear stories of camaraderie and stories of togetherness and working as a team, particularly as, you know, we've got a situation now where specialties don't exist. You know, everyone is just a COVID doctor, and we're all kind of moving towards the exact same goals and doing the same sorts of things. So it is just interesting to see how conflict reshapes that narrative and how it reshapes the way that we work together.
Yeah, and connection is very, very important. It's one of the 5, if you want to look at the New Economic Foundation, the 5 pillars of wellbeing, connection is one of those. And that's really, really important, because connection can lead to lots of other important aspects of wellbeing in our personal sense, and also in our external sense, and our pro-social behaviours as well. And so it's really, really important on a micro scale and also macro scale of wellbeing. And so I think you're naturally seeing people draw to those types of behaviours because they know that they're intuitively they know that that's good for them, or it feels good, or they're getting positive benefits from that. So I think we're seeing a lot of that type of behaviour in our communities, but also in our professional communities as well, which is really important.
Yeah, and I do wonder whether, I mean, we've seen so much disintegration of connection within the medical profession over the last couple of decades, you know, that the firm structures disappeared, and with everyone sort of on rotations that changed so much, and changing hospitals, and, you know, just not having that group of people that you get to know really well, you know, especially as juniors when you first start, that doesn't exist anymore. And, you know, doctors' messes disappearing, and again, that sense of community and togetherness being eroded. So yeah, it is interesting to see that in conflict we band together. You know, that we come together, and that is our first instinct. And so I wonder to some extent whether the kind of opposite of conflict, or maybe the antidote to conflict, is togetherness. It is community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the key to that is ensuring that you are so just touching on a couple of things that you're talking about before, is giving yourself permission to feel what you want to feel, because in doing that you're connecting with others as well, because you're appreciating that others are probably feeling the same similar types of emotions too. So in connecting with your own self, that gives you that empathy to connect with others. But also by doing that, and also practicing self-compassion, that allows you to practice self-compassion to others, not self-compassion to others, allows you to practice compassion to others as well. So if, like I was saying, if you're feeling in a particular way, it's more than likely that your team are as well. And so I think that whole togetherness, that whole redesignation of the firm structure that you have in COVID teams, so that you have teams working together, is so important, because relying on people, knowing who you're working with, you know, knowing how the different people in your team work is so important, because you rely on them, and it's not just relying on them professionally, it's relying on them personally as well, because they don't seem like they're in a good mood today, how can I help them, how can I support them? That's really, really important when we're working in environments like we're working in. So permission and compassion are really, really important.
Yeah, earlier we were talking about how an external conflict drove an internal conflict, and now this feels like talking about how internal resolution of conflict then can lead on to an external resolution as well. So it's really interesting to kind of come full circle in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. And also the last thing I'd like to just mention is kindness and reframing language, because when we individually start to reframe our language, other people around us start to as well. It's the power of positivity is contagious.
What a word to use at this time, Emmy. That's brilliant.
Well, it's a good thing. It's a good thing to be, wanting to spread the positivity around.
This is good, contagious.
We can spread something, spread positivity. I really like what I did there.
Amy, as always, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for being here. If people want to reach out to you, where can they find you?
This is where I get really confused. So I have a Twitter handle, which is @yourwellbeingdoctor. My website is www.yourwellbeingdoctor, and I have a Facebook page now too, which is Your Wellbeing Doctor.
Amazing. We'll pop everything in the show notes so you can find Amy easily. Thank you so much again, and take care.
Thank you so much for having me, Anjali. It's always a pleasure to meet you and see you.
Bye.
Bye.
Whew, thank you so much, guys, for sticking with me tonight. Apologies for the technical issues. That is all for this evening. I hope you enjoyed my chat with Amy. Join me again next week. I will have Dr. Evgenia Galinskaya on with me to talk about the theme of hope. Quick note, it will be at 8:30 rather than 7:30 next week, so an hour later. But that's just for next week. After that, we'll go back to normal time. So as always, please like, subscribe, share, find me on Facebook and Twitter @DisillusionedMed. Come join the conversation. If you're enjoying these broadcasts, please do share them with your community. It's really helpful when people sort of post links on Facebook or in a group or on Twitter or in a forum that you're part of. That'd be fantastic, and I'd be so, so grateful. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care, and I will speak to you soon. Stay inspired. Bye.